Good evening. Welcome to Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church. We're a liberal religious community where love works. I'm the Reverend Katie Romano Griffin, assistant minister here, and I just want to give you some logistics because it's really important to us that you're comfortable. If you go back out through the doors and make a right and then another right, you'll find the restrooms. The women's room will be down the hall to the right, and the men's room to the left. We'll have staff and volunteers rounding, and we can help you find it. We also have a place where you can get water back there as well. You'll notice that there's an exit right here, an emergency exit, and of course, the exit's directly behind you. There's going to be a place where the senator is going to take questions from everyone this evening. There are index cards in the back with some pens. If you can write your question on an index card throughout the evening and place them in the basket in the back, we are going to sort through the questions and make sure that we get questions to the senator. If you would like someone to bring a card to you, you'll notice there are ushers around the room, and we'll be happy to make sure that you get one. Now, I would like to introduce our congregation's senior minister, the Reverend Abi Janamanchi.
Thank you, Katie, and good evening and welcome. Happy New Year to all of you. I'm so glad we're coming together in this way in the beginning of this new year. And we also have tonight present some of our elected officials as well as candidates running for office. So I just want to take a moment to recognize those of you who are here. If you wouldn't mind, if you'd please rise so we may see and recognize you. All right. Welcome. We're glad to have you here. It's really an honor and a privilege and a joy to welcome back and introduce our neighbor. That comes first. And Cedar Lane friend, Senator Chris Van Hollen. Senator Van Hollen, as all of you know, was elected to the U.S. Senate by the people of Maryland in November 2016. Yes. Senator Van Hollen is committed to fighting every day to ensure that our state and our nation live up to their full promise of equal rights, equal justice, and equal opportunity. Senator Van Hollen began his calling, and it is a calling in public service, as a member of the Maryland State Legislature, where he served for 4 years in the House of Delegates and for 8 years in the Senate. There he became known as an incredibly effective and honest legislator who worked hard for the rights and concerns of everyday Marylanders and working people. His legislative record in Annapolis earned him the praise from the Washington Post, which called him one of the most effective members of the Maryland legislature. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2002, representing Maryland's 8th congressional district. He served as a member of the Democratic leadership and was elected by his colleagues to be the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, focusing on protecting vital programs like Social Security and Medicare. Senator Van Hollen, while in the U.S. House of Representatives, played a leading role in obtaining federal funds to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, providing loan guarantees for renewable energy projects. He supported whistleblower protections and the passing of the Affordable Care Act. Yeah. Including ensuring that young adults receive expanded access to health insurance. So if you're a young adult, you know who to thank. Throughout his career, Senator Van Hollen has been a champion of the environment, education, healthcare, national security, sensible gun control, sane foreign policy, civil rights, and human rights. He's well known for striving to find common sense solutions to difficult national issues and working across the aisle on issues of common concern, like fighting childhood cancer, expanding medical research, and passing the ABLE Act to assist families with disabilities. In January 2015, he released a comprehensive plan to address the problem of growing inequality in the US and provide a blueprint for building an economy that works for everyone, a goal that he is committed to fighting for in the US Senate. Senator Van Hollen is a graduate of Swarthmore College, the John F. Kennedy School of Public Policy at Harvard University, and Georgetown University Law Center, where he attended night school. Now, the connection I feel with the senator has to do with his early life. His early and formative years were spent in South Asia, where his parents were serving as Foreign Service officers. They were stationed in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and India. And the senator attended the multicultural, multinational Kodaikanal International School in southern India, barely 100 miles from where I grew up. So I have a particular interest and connection. He and his wife, Catherine Wilkins, are the proud parents of Anna, Nicholas, and Alexander, and they reside here in Kensington. Now, when I've heard Senator Van Hollen speak in various settings, I've been struck by the way in which he approaches issues and the way in which he captures the essence of an issue or a problem and how he proposes ways in which we might be engaged in finding solutions. And I was sharing this morning in my reflections a quote from the late Václav Havel, who, when he was inaugurated as president of the Czech Republic, said, "My program is to bring spirituality, moral responsibility, humaneness, and humility into politics. And in that respect, to make clear that our deeds do not disappear into the dark hole of time." Now, what a remarkable thing it is for someone to say, much less a would-be politician, especially given that we live in times where many politicians seem to be saying lots of stupid things these days. So it is truly, truly a gift and a blessing to have someone represent us in this state of Maryland, someone who brings that level of thoughtfulness, intentionality, depth, commitment, and passion to public service and to the work of the people, for the people. So my friends, let us offer a particularly warm Cedar Lane welcome to Senator Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is this, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. It's great to be here at Cedar Lane. Reverend Janamanchi, thank you for your leadership here at Cedar Lane and throughout our community and our state. And if you could all join me in thanking the Reverend, because he's been a great leader, a spiritual leader, but someone who also believes in putting faith into action like all of you here. And so, given our common sort of Indian background, I always also use the greeting Namaste. Namaste. And I want to say to all of you, it was a great experience growing up in different parts of the world, having the opportunity to interact and grow up with people of different cultures, different backgrounds. And of course, Cedar Lane is dedicated to the idea that we want to bring people together in unity. So it's great to be with all of you. And Happy New Year to all of you. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of glad to put 2017 behind us. And I'm sure you're all very confident and reassured now that in 2018, President Trump has assured us that he's a stable genius. So what could go wrong in 2018? You know, seriously, having the opportunity to be here this evening, it's a timely gathering as we set off on the new year. And I do want to thank Cedar Lane and the Cedar Lane community for being a welcoming community and for being a community that does want to put our ideals and principles into action every day, both right here in our community, in our state, around the country, and in fact, around the world. A community that takes seriously the idea that we need to strive every day to build what Dr. King called the beloved community, to make sure we heed the injunction from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that we judge people by the conduct of their character and not by the color of their skin or not by who they love or by who they pray to, but that we are a community that welcomes and embraces people from all different backgrounds and lives up to really what was the original idea and ideal behind the United States of America, which was the promise of equal rights and equal justice and equal opportunity. And if you think about it, the history of our country is really the struggle to live up to that original promise. And we know we've traveled a long and tough road as we work to try to get reality closer and closer to the principle of equal rights and equal justice and equal opportunity. We had to, of course, overcome the evil institution of slavery. We've had many important movements throughout our country, from the women's movement to the labor rights movement to the environmental movement to the civil rights movement, and we've made progress. We've made progress as a country, but it's an unfinished piece of work. And all of us know that if we want to continue to work to build a more perfect union and really make real the idea that we're all in this together and have equal rights and equal justice and equal opportunity, we've got to make sure that we roll up our sleeves and get engaged every day in the political process and in our communities to make sure that we reach out to others. Now, this has been a tough time as we've traveled that journey, and we've made progress, as I said. But if you look at the last presidential campaign and the last year, the first year, the Trump administration, you saw, first of all, a campaign that was really based on division, really focused on trying to turn people against one another. You may remember that scene in Trump Tower when Donald Trump comes down the escalator and gives that talk, and one of the first things out of his mouth is he's talking about Mexican rapists and trying to disparage and turn people against each other. And that was, of course, just the beginning. And since then, we've seen a continuation of that. But what has been promising and heartening for me has been the response throughout the country. And the response around the country was not people sitting back and just watching it and taking it. The response from congregations like this one right here in Cedar Lane was to reach out to our friends and neighbors, people of different backgrounds and different religions, and to say, you know, we're your neighbor. And we're all in this together, and this is not who we are as a country, and we're going to work with you to make sure that you know that you're welcome here in our community. And so around this time a year ago, here in Montgomery County, you saw all sorts of interfaith gatherings, people gathering throughout the county, throughout the state, and really around the country, reaching out to neighbors and saying, we're all in this together. And we've got to do that because the consequences of that sort of deep division and the sort of bigotry of the conversation that the Trump campaign introduced had really dangerous consequences in the real world. We have seen, as the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented, increases in the country over the last couple years in hate crimes, targeted against a whole range of people just because they're different, and the Muslim community especially has been a victim of a lot of those targets around the country. So it's made it all the more important that everybody here in this room and people of goodwill around the country responded and said, no, we're not going to let that rhetoric define us as a country. We're going to take action in our communities, and we're going to take action around the country. And so I want to thank you for being part of a community that has helped us sort of navigate these very difficult times in our country. And we can't do it if we don't have people who are willing to take responsibility to reach out to others, as you have and so many others have. And then, of course, about a year ago, we also saw another major response, which was the day after the inauguration, we saw the Women's March here in... How many people were at the Women's March? All right, I thought so. We had the Women's March here in Washington, around the country, around the world. And of course, we also had a number of other important marches, right? We had the March for Science, we had the March on Climate Change, we had a whole series of people coming to the streets and marching in protest and saying, we are not going to let President Trump define this country. We are going to make sure this country lives up to its values. So that gave me great hope as we set into the new year, and we need to keep sustaining that because we have seen a continuing pattern from this administration about the effort to divide. We saw the really awful failed response, both morally and from a leadership perspective, to the events in Charlottesville. We saw the President of the United States at a moment when leadership and strong moral statements were required, took the opposite approach, and it only further divided us. And so that effort to come together is really important. Now, the key, of course, is to take a march and make it into a movement, and take that movement and make sure that that movement gets translated into real political change. And we saw a very successful example of people getting mobilized to fight an effort to turn back the clock when people organized to defeat the effort to totally repeal the Affordable Care Act and blow up Obamacare altogether. So I want to thank everybody in this room who helped push back so hard on that effort, which of course was the first order of business of the new administration, which was to totally repeal the Affordable Care Act. And thanks to people in this room and people around the world, that did not happen. So thank you to all of you who helped rally in that effort. And what I found, what I experienced in that particular debate, was that it was political within Washington, it was political in Congress, it was partisan in Congress, but around the country, as time went on, it was not so partisan. You had hospitals in rural areas teaming up with hospitals in suburban areas and urban areas saying this is going to be really bad for hospital care in all parts of our states. You saw nurses teaming up with the doctors in the hospital saying this is really bad for health care. And all of you know that doctors groups and nurses groups, I mean, they're not necessarily one political party or another. If you look at the AMA over a period of time, they've been a relatively conservative group overall, but they weighed in strongly, united with the others to say this is bad for health care in America. And then you saw every patient advocacy group that took a position, and almost all of them did, say that repealing the Affordable Care Act is literally bad for the health of people in this country. You saw the American Cancer Society, the American Diabetes Association, the American Alzheimer's Association, the American Lung Association, American Heart Association, all of them weighed in. You saw AARP weigh in. You saw the children's health groups weigh in, just about everybody. And that movement made it difficult for people to get up and argue that this bill that they were saying is somehow important to health care was actually going to be good for health in America when every single health advocacy organization was opposed to it. And so that was a real model, in my view, for how people can organize at the local level throughout the country. Because when you have someone from the American Cancer Society coming to you and saying this is bad for your health, it's hard to then put it in a purely partisan lens. And same, of course, with those other health organizations. And so because of that outpouring and that reaction from around the country, it became much more difficult for Republicans in the House and Senate to totally ram that through. Now it got very close. And the other lesson, another really important lesson, which, you know, I hope we don't have to learn I hope we don't have to learn ever again in this country, is how all of these big issues can come down to literally one vote, right? In the United States Senate, we blocked the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act by one vote. Got out of the House, one vote in the United States Senate. You had Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, and of course Senator McCain at the end, joining Democrats who were united in blocking the effort of repeal. But it was a close call, and it was a very clear example of how every one of those votes in the United States Senate counts. And I don't think that the outcome would have been what it was if you hadn't seen that outpouring of support around the country. Here in Maryland, we had lots of rallies, and it was just a reflection of what we saw happening around the country. So that was a very important victory for grassroots activism. Then, of course, you come to November, and one of the questions was whether or not the marches and that movement was going to make a difference at the ballot boxes. And, of course, the November elections in Virginia and New Jersey and other parts of the country were sort of the first indication of whether or not all of that political energy was going to make a difference when it actually came to voting turnout. And what we saw in votes from Washington State to some in New Hampshire to South Carolina to the governor's race in New Jersey and, of course, to the races in Virginia was, yes, people are energized and people are going to fight back to reclaim the values that we believe this country stands for. And the importance of the Virginia elections was not just the fact that the governor's race turned out as it did. It was the margin of victory in that governor's race, and of course it was the depth of the victories in the House of Delegates, right down the ballot in the House of Delegate races. And I mentioned the importance of vote in the Senate. I mean, what clearer example do you have of the importance of every vote than one of those votes, one of those elections in the Virginia House of Delegates coming down to a coin toss? And the result of that coin toss determining by one vote who has the majority in the Virginia House of Delegates. So, look, I wish the coin had flipped the other way, obviously, but the lesson for everybody is that there was a huge turnout in that Virginia House of Delegates races. Nobody predicted that you would see that kind of change. And all of you know many of the examples of the candidates that won there, throwing out candidates, you know, incumbent candidates who had been intolerant and as divisive in some cases as the President of the United States. So that was another example of how that energy can flow through. Now we come to the bad news. I'm kind of going chronologically as I look at 2017 here. The bad news of the passage of this really atrocious tax bill. And I will tell you that this is something that has really outraged me, and people who look at the details of this will, if they don't already know it, find out just how bad this tax bill is for our country over a period of time. It was a huge corporate tax giveaway. The corporate tax code can use some reforming. There's no doubt about it. And our overall tax code should be reformed. I mean, we have a tax code before this bill that was already stacked in favor of very powerful special interest, already stacked in favor of the wealthiest in this country. And it's actually really hard to think of a tax plan that will take a tax code that's already stacked for very powerful people and make it that much worse. But they found a way to do it. And the result is a very big corporate tax cut that goes on forever, And then you're going to have millions of middle-class taxpayers that will see their taxes go up. So here's a bill masquerading as, quote, a middle-class tax cut in which millions of middle-class Americans will see their taxes go up. And by the way, a lot of Marylanders are going to see their taxes go up, middle-class Marylanders, because of the elimination of the deduction for state and local taxes. And so in 2019, for example, foreign stockholders, and I want to make the point because a lot of people don't do this, haven't sort of focused on this, and if you think of a lot of the Trump rhetoric during the campaign, I think a lot of people who supported him on this America First sort of slogan would be shocked to find out that $49 billion in tax cuts in 2019 is going to go to foreign stockholders, because 1/3 of the stockholders in American corporations are wealthy foreigners. And so all that money in that tax cut is essentially flowing through to 1/3 of those stockholders, in addition to a lot of very wealthy Americans. And I should point out that if you look at the individual side of the tax cut, millionaires in America will get, on average, a $70,000 tax cut under this bill. Now, there are going to be lots of people who, at least for a little period of time, see some tax cuts in the United States of America. And the thing to know about that is that compared to folks at the very top, those tax cuts are going to be very small. Compared to corporations, they're going to be temporary, and as opposed to corporate tax cuts, which go on forever. So, for example, when this thing fully kicks in, American households with under $70,000 will actually see tax increases when this is phased in after 10 years, because the tax cuts for essentially for working Americans are phased out at that time as the corporate tax cuts continue. So this idea that trickle-down economics is going to sort of give rocket propellant to our economy is an idea that we saw fail miserably many times in our history already, including back in 2001 and 2003 during the Bush tax cuts. And I can assure you that it's unfortunately, it's not going to happen again. You're not going to see this big economic boost as a result of these tax cuts. Now, it should be no surprise to anybody that when you provide a big corporate tax cut and dramatically increase the profits and bottom line of corporations, their stock value is going to go up. I mean, they just got a big windfall. And it's absolutely true that some of these companies are, at least on a one-time basis, providing some bonuses to their employees. But here's what was promised. And Donald Trump held this up, and so did Republican senators on the United States Senate floor. They all promised that trickle-down economics was going to lead to a $4,000 pay increase this year that would be built in to people's paychecks over time. So $4,000 a year for 10 years, that's $40,000 over 10 years. And as much as we'd all like to see people get those pay increases, and there are policies that we can apply that would help people get increased take-home pay, and we should be focusing on that, and I put forward a lot of ideas on that. This is not going to be the way to do it. And so as we take this debate into the coming year, we are going to be very focused on asking workers around the country whether or not they got their promised $4,000 pay increase in the base of their salary, because that was what was promised, and unfortunately that is not going to be what is delivered. And so there are going to be a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump because he thought he was there to remember the, quote, forgotten Americans, who thought that he was going to be there for them and are going to be very, very disappointed, I believe, when they find out that these big corporate tax cuts are not there for them, and that instead what's going to happen is that as a result of the huge increase in the national debt, $1.5 trillion over 10 years, you're going to have Republicans in the House and Senate turning right around and talking about dramatically cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Paul Ryan's already talked about it. Mitch McConnell is a little more leery about it, but the reality is that they all forgot about the lecturing on the debt when it came to big tax cuts, but will very quickly rediscover that as we go forward. And by the way, if you add it up, the increase in the national debt comes to $1,500 per income tax-paying household in the United States a year, right? So over 10 years, that's $15,000 additional debt for income tax-paying households in the United States of America. So we're going to have to really take this argument to the country, because I can tell you that as we're gathered here today, the Koch brothers are paying for ads in a lot of states to essentially create the impression that this is a great thing for America, and they're focused on a lot of our Senate candidates in the process, Senate candidates who stood up against this corporate tax giveaway, and the Koch brothers are already at work spending money on ads, trying to lay the groundwork for defeating them. So the tax bill was no doubt a setback, but I do not believe that it's going to be the great political boom that Republicans think it will be to them and those who supported it. Now, on the good news side, and I'm almost at the end of last year. On the good news side, we had this really important Senate race in the state of Alabama. And I was very pleased to be able to welcome, as all of us were, Doug Jones. He was sworn in as a new U.S. Senator just this week. And it really was a victory for dignity and decency over sort of partisanship. And I think all of you know that Alabama is very tough political territory for Democratic candidates. The last Democratic candidate from Alabama to win was Shelby himself, and then of course he switched parties after that. And so what we saw in Alabama was a couple of things. Number one, we saw again another huge kind of turnout, the kind of turnout we saw in Virginia. And we saw that turnout especially in the African American community, but we also saw independent voters crossing over in big numbers, not crossing over, independent voters who went all in for Doug Jones, and even a lot of Republicans, moderate Republicans, who decided, despite the fact that Trump went down to Florida and told everybody to vote for Roy Moore, that for the good of Alabama and the good of the country, they were going to vote for Doug Jones. And so that was another very important moment in last year, and it also created a little change in the Senate. So now we need 2 votes in the United States Senate rather than 3 on big issues like that. So let's fast forward now to this year, and here's what I would say, and then I want to really take some questions. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of a lay of the land of where we are now in the next couple of weeks. But I think from a perspective of political mobilization, the good news is that so many people do seem to be energized, both to fight on these issues and also to take that fight to the ballot box. And there are obviously a whole range of issues. I mean, I've just scratched the surface this evening, but we have issues, obviously, of foreign policy, and the Reverend mentioned the need for a sane foreign policy, and there are a whole lot of very, very, very serious issues on foreign policy that are going on right now, as all of you know, in our country. And none of them can be really solved by presidential tweets. I think you know that. We also have a big debate, obviously, on criminal justice reform, and we saw a setback this year with just this week with Attorney General Sessions, essentially saying that federal policy will again allow people to be locked up for marijuana use. Now, I don't know if they're actually going to apply this, But the fact that they changed that policy obviously created a setback in states where we've been trying to decriminalize substance abuse and allow for things like medical marijuana. And of course, we've also seen many, many attacks on the environment and a new policy in this administration that you can't utter the word climate change. I mean, this is really kind of scary in terms of the big brother approach to brainwashing in agencies. So we've got a whole lot of issues that we've got to tackle. And we're going to need everybody to remain engaged in this process throughout this year. And then, as I said, making sure that people register their feelings at the ballot box. Now, let me just say a word in closing about where we are right now in this budget debate. Because, look, we're right outside of the nation's capital here. I always say that it's great to represent the state of Maryland because there are people who are very focused and engaged with what's happening. On the other hand, in every audience, you find a lot of people who will know a whole lot more than I ever will about a certain federal government program. So all of you, a lot of you are following this very closely. But here's the situation we're in. The fiscal year of the United States government begins October 1st. And Congress, once again, did not get its act together, and so instead of passing a new budget, a new appropriations bills for the current fiscal year that started October 1st, we're on a continuing resolution, which means we essentially put last year's budget on automatic pilot, and that automatic pilot will expire on January 19th, so not long from right now. And there's a whole lot of unfinished business that is at stake here. One of the big fights that's getting sort of overshadowed by some of the other debates that are surrounding the budget bill, but we have a big battle over how much we're going to invest in our kids' education, in medical research, in transportation, because what you saw come out of the House of Representatives was a proposal that would dramatically increase just military spending and essentially pay for the dramatic increase in military spending by dramatically cutting our investment in things like Head Start, education, healthcare, and other social service programs. And the position that many of us have taken is no. We will support a strong investment in our national security. Of course, we need to be strong as a country, but part of our national strength also means having an educated workforce, making sure kids have an opportunity to succeed. And we've also got to make sure that we address a lot of the social services issues, invest in Head Start and other things. So that is one big battle that's going on. What is the level of investment in those parts of the non-military parts of the budget? And we have been pushing very hard for robust levels because under sequester, you're going to see a very deep across-the-board cut if nothing is done. There are also a lot of other big unresolved issues. The Children's Health Insurance Program, funding community health centers, and of course the issue you've been hearing a lot about, which is making sure that dreamers have a secure future in our country. As all of you know, Trump sort of lit the fuse, the time fuse, on the legal status of dreamers until March of this year. As of March of this year, if no action is taken, they will all be subject to deportation. And so we've got to resolve the dreamers issue before January 19th. So all of these issues are upon us right now, and I can tell you as of today that I'm not sure exactly how this will resolve itself. Now, I just want to close in saying that nobody should be rooting for a government shutdown. We got some calls in our office saying, you've got to shut down the government if you don't get X, Y, and Z. The only person who's tweeted about shutting down the government is Donald Trump, who talked about a good government shutdown in a tweet a couple months back. We are going to use all of our leverage and power to try to accomplish these things. And if President Trump doesn't work with us to do it, then he would be responsible, in my view, for any kind of failure here in government shutdown. After all, he's president of the United States. You have Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. Anyway, I just want to mention that because it's going to be an issue that probably comes to a boil, will come to a boil in the next couple weeks, one way or another. I hope we can resolve these issues. I'm not sure. But that is an example of what's at stake as we head into 2018, and it's another example of why we need all of you to stay focused on the issues and make sure that we continue to put your ideals and principles into action at the grassroots level. And I do believe that this congregation is a congregation that is dedicated to really making a difference. And one of the great things about Cedar Lane and the Cedar Lane community has been its commitment to put that faith into action. And I'm going to close with one of my favorite sayings that some of you may have heard me say before, but it's that the world needs dreamers and the world needs doers, but most of all, the world needs dreamers who do. And I see Cedar Lane as a community that has an idea of how we can build a stronger, more beloved community, but doesn't just think about it, but also rolls up its sleeves to put those ideas into action in our community. So thank you for having me here. And let's make 2018 better than 2017. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Senator, for your inspiring remarks and not only listing out the many challenges that we have encountered and continue to deal with, but also a path forward. And for your call to action, which I hope those of you who are Cedar Lane members are paying heed to. We have a whole bunch of questions on a wide range of topics. So I'm going to try and get through as many as possible so we get a chance for you to address many of them. The first one is, what is the most...
I know the translation is keep my response short, right?
Well, we both are in professions that provide us ample opportunities to provide people with the gift of words. So I never say that. What is the most effective way for ordinary citizens to lobby Congress?
So, very good question, and one, of course, that we've gotten a lot over the last year. And so let me just say, generally speaking, in terms of approaching a member of Congress, there are many ways, and they're all, in my view, effective. But it also depends on the overall circumstances. So the best way to directly, I think, get a member of Congress is to go down and try and see the member of Congress in their district offices when you can. And I'm talking generally now. Since I'm in Maryland, obviously we are closer than most. But if people should go to the district offices of their members, come to Washington, write, call, email, text, all of those things. Now, the question we get a lot in Maryland, especially when it came to things like the Affordable Care Act and the tax bill, is because Senator Cardin and I and 7 out of 8 members of the Maryland congressional delegation are fighting the battle that is sort of consistent with the view of the great majority of the people in Maryland. What do Marylanders do? And the answer is a couple things. Those of you who are members of national organizations should weigh in with those national organizations and make sure they're really engaged in this battle. I mentioned the healthcare fight. So if you're a member of the American Cancer Society or the American Alzheimer's Association or any of those patient protection groups, in that fight, it was really important for people in all parts of the country to call up their national association and say, hope you're weighing in every day and hope you're organizing efforts, especially targeted at the states where we have the best chance of changing the minds of some senators, whether it was Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski or John McCain. That was really important. So number one is, if you're part of a group that has a national presence or a presence in other states, make sure that they're really engaged in those key states. Number two, if you know people in these other states, I will tell you, getting on social media these days, of course, makes it a lot easier. Email can also help communicate with people. All of you probably know somebody in one of the states where you had a key vote. Maybe not all of you, but a lot of people do. And making sure that people in those states are showing up at the state or district offices of their members of Congress was really important. And because that kind of face-to-face effort, even if you don't actually get the meeting, but you show up to try to get a meeting, you may have seen a lot of the reporting on town halls across the country during the Affordable Care Act. That made a difference, in my view, that kind of activism and people turning out. So those are two things when it comes to issues before Congress where you can get involved in trying to make sure you change the outcome. Now, obviously, as I indicated, we've got to make sure the movement translates into differences at the polls and elections. And so, you know, there are obviously lots of Maryland elections where you have people who have, you know, different views, and it's important to listen to all the candidates, whether it's local elections or statewide elections. And then in terms of the national elections, there are going to be a number of congressional races. There'll be one here, you know, there'll be a couple here in Maryland. There'll be one on the Eastern Shore. And people can go help the Democratic candidate there. There are going to be a number in Virginia. There are going to be some in Pennsylvania. And in the Senate races, I can tell you, we have two big ones that are in driving distance. We have three races in driving distance. I do believe, as of right now, Tim McCain is in a strong position. Tim Kaine is in a strong position. But that could change. We also have in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey is being challenged in that Senate race by somebody who's running in the Trump mold, sort of anti-immigration policy. And then in West Virginia, we have Joe Manchin. Now, I would dare say that on a number of issues, many of us would disagree with Joe Manchin on some issues. But I can tell you, he has been a fighter when it came to protecting the Affordable Care Act. He recognized that this tax cut was a big corporate tax giveaway. And he will face a potentially very tough election. Right now, you've got two Republican candidates duking it out in the primary. So anyway, Marylanders can get engaged both on the issues in the ways I talked about, but also in campaigns in this other way. But I will remind people that we have a lot of races here in the state of Maryland as well this time around, from the lot of races.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions on DACA and the DREAM Act. One is there opportunity for you and other progressive senators and congresspersons to influence moderate Republicans on DACA and other 2018 issues? And what are the chances of DACA passing without the wall?
So there are in both the House and the Senate a number of Republicans who support the Democratic position on DACA. Well, let me rephrase that. They don't necessarily support the Clean DREAM Act bill, which is what we believe should pass. The Clean DREAM Act bill is a specific piece of legislation that does not include things like, you know, monies for the wall and all these other kind of things. But there are a number of Republicans in the Senate and even more in the House who do believe we should give DACA recipients security and permanent legal status, and then we can debate about exactly how all that works over a period of time. The DACA bill would give people the ability to become permanent legal residents and then seek citizenship over a period of time. So if we were, I believe that in the House, for sure, if you were going to have a straight up or down vote on protecting dreamers, we would pass. It would pass because you'd have virtually, probably every Democrat, and then you'd have enough Republicans. I think that's also the case in the Senate, probably, that we would get every Democrat. Every Democrat supports the DREAM Act, and then we need those now two Republicans to come on board, and I think that there probably are 2 Republicans. Now, I don't know whether you'd get a filibuster in the Senate from some of the Republicans who oppose the DREAM Act. So we are now in the process of trying to negotiate on the DACA issue. And spending money on a wall is a total waste of taxpayer dollars. I will. And by the way, I do remember Trump saying Mexico was going to pay for the wall, not American taxpayers. And so it was disappointing to see the request that came forward just a few days ago for about $18 billion for a wall. Now, I think it's important to stress Democrats have been strong supporters of smart border security. I mean, it's important to have secure borders, in my view, and Democrats have supported funds for border security. But the issue here is what is wasteful taxpayer spending and what is not wasteful taxpayer spending. And every single Homeland Security expert will tell you that building a 2,000-mile wall or whatever the total distance is a really bad use of your money. And so that is one of many issues that is going to have to get resolved in this debate. And that's why I say, as we're here tonight, I'm not sure I can say with confidence that this is going to get resolved between now and the 19th. And so there's going to be some really choppy waters because we've got to address these issues. And the issue of money for a wall is just one piece of this. So we can have a negotiation over smart investments to improve our border security, and hopefully that's the direction this will go. There are also other elements to this debate that you've probably heard from some of our Republican colleagues having to do with family-based immigration. So a lot of moving parts. What I can say for sure is that we are trying to resolve these issues to give dreamers the security and certainty that they deserve. These are kids, as all of you know, who have grown up in America. This is the only country they know. They pledge allegiance to the flag in their classrooms every day with every other kid. And so we've got to deal with and address this issue and provide them with certainty and hope.
What concerns you most about foreign affairs?
Oh my God, where
North
to start?
Korea or Iran or Pakistan?
Phew. James Carville had this quote once. He was asked to open a question like this. He said, "This is like being a mosquito in a nudist colony. You don't know where to start." I think we all know, look, there are a number of big issues. Obviously, North Korea is a pressing national security issue. And it is a very serious situation. You may have seen the story, I think it was the Post, could have been the Times today, about the fact that U.S. intelligence agencies did not anticipate how quickly North Korea would obtain the capacity to fire off a long-range missile. And so that capacity, combined with the fact that they do have nuclear warheads, the question then is whether they can marry them up, and at what point can they do that with any kind of confidence and seriously threaten the United States with a nuclear ICBM attack. So it's a very, very, very serious national security issue. Obviously, there are no simple answers here. This is an issue that previous administrations, both the Obama administration and the Bush administration, grappled with, and obviously did not succeed in stopping the Korean nuclear program. So what I believe we should be doing is building up greater pressure on North Korea and pursuing at the same time a diplomatic track. And I actually have teamed up with a Republican senator to introduce, and we passed unanimously out of the Senate Banking Committee, sanctions bill that would apply what are called secondary sanctions against other countries like China that continue to allow their banks, in many cases, or their financial firms, to be used as conduits for trade for North Korea, because you're not going to get North Korea to seriously come to the negotiating table if they don't feel serious economic pressure. Now, will that work for sure? I can't say for sure that it will, right? I mean, Korea has been subject to sanctions in the past, but never have they really faced the full squeeze generated by these secondary sanctions, because there's been a lot of leakage in the economic sanctions that have been applied by the international community. So this legislation is designed to really tighten the economic pressure, and so that you can have a greater opportunity, in my view, to have a successful negotiation. The goal of the negotiation, ultimate goal of the negotiation, of course, is to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. The United States withdrew its tactical nuclear weapons from Korea many years back, and so that's the ultimate goal. Now, you're not going to get to that goal all at once, and so there are a number of ideas about freezes, North Koreans freeze their program, both the nuclear program and the ICBM program, while the United States and South Korea take steps, again, with the goal of getting to zero nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. I worry greatly about the way the president has conducted his approach, and as you've probably seen, he's undercut his own Secretary of State on a number of occasions. Secretary Tillerson, who I did not support, but he has been somebody that, at least compared to the Commander-in-Chief, has shown some prudence when it comes to the conduct of foreign policy. He has had his, he's been undermined and undercut by the president at every turn. So obviously a very dicey situation. I can tell you there's bipartisan concern on Capitol Hill about the way the White House and the president specifically actually have conducted themselves when it comes to North Korea. There are lots of other very difficult foreign policy challenges. So for example, in the Middle East, in my view, it was a big mistake for the president to declare that the full recognition of Jerusalem as part of the state of Israel. This has been an issue that's always been subject to what are called final status negotiations, and the response, of course, from the Palestinians was predictable, which is that, the United States cannot be in any way an honest broker in these discussions after doing what it did with respect to Israel and with respect to Jerusalem. And so I also think that you're seeing an administration that is, on the one hand, attacking institutions like the United Nations, and then discovering that they really need the United Nations. So, for example, every time something happens on North Korea or somewhere else, we're there, or in Iran now, in terms of the protests, we're at the United Nations saying, we need your help. So we've got to recognize the importance of the United Nations and stop undermining their efforts. And the final thing I will say relates not necessarily to any one foreign policy hotspot, but just generally speaking, there has been an incredible attack on the Foreign Service in the State Department. They have essentially, number one, they've put a put a hiring freeze in place, which has undermined our efforts to bring in new people. A lot of diplomats have left the State Department or have been driven out at the State Department. There are a whole lot of unfilled positions around the world, important positions around the world that we need as part of exercising our diplomacy. And so I actually am very worried about that situation. I was approached early on this year by a senator from Alaska by the name of Dan Sullivan, who served in the Bush administration and worked at the National Security Council and did some work at the State Department. He asked whether, based on my background, I'd be interested in forming the Foreign Service Caucus to be an advocate for the Foreign Service. So we did launch that, and we've had a number of we've had two important discussions with folks in leadership positions at the State Department, including recently with the Deputy Secretary of State, whose also last name is Sullivan, who did provide us some assurances that things would change in terms of how they're managing things at the State Department in terms of Foreign Service, but until we actually see those changes, I'm not going to be satisfied. But they made some important, provided some important assurances, and now the question is whether those assurances will come to pass.
Another question, will the American Disabilities Act be repealed by Congress?
No. It will not be. The American Disabilities Act will not be repealed by Congress. I can assure you that. And the reason I can provide some assurance of that is that, you know, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but both the tax bill and the Affordable Care Act repeal effort were done under a congressional process called budget reconciliation. Many in the room may be familiar with that. You may not be familiar with that. But budget reconciliation is a process that is important in the United States Senate because most bills in the United States Senate that come up under the regular order come up and are subject to a 60-vote filibuster threshold that has to be overcome. So even though final passage of any legislation in the Senate requires 51 votes, if you can muster at least 40 senators in opposition to something, you can actually stop something from coming to that final vote. There are a couple exceptions to that, and the biggest exception, well, one exception now is all executive nominations, including all judicial nominations, including now for the Supreme Court. The other major exception to that is this reconciliation process, and the Affordable Care Act repeal effort and the tax bill that just passed were both done under that process, which is why they could pass the tax bill with, it was 52-48, I think, in the end. John McCain wasn't there, but he was going to vote for it. So 51-48. But other legislation, like if you really want to try to repeal the ADA, you would have to you'd have to go through this normal process, and I can assure you that I can find 39 other people who will fight like hell to make sure that doesn't happen.
What can we do on a state and local level to preserve net neutrality?
Well, as you know, this now is in a proceeding that was launched by the FCC to change the rules on net neutrality. It will be subject to a long sort of a regulatory process, and then I suspect, well, not suspect, it will be subject to legal challenge, and then the question is, as it works through the court, what can Congress do? And I'd like to be able to report to you that, you know, we could muster you know, a congressional majority to block the FCC action. As of today, we don't have the votes to do that in Congress, and that is why the court proceeding is going to be so important in the coming days. Now, as I said, elections can change things, and that's why every vote at the end of the day counts. So, you know, if we could muster the votes in Congress, Congress obviously could take action to overturn this. But we don't have the votes today. And so for now, like in many other areas, we're going to rely on some of the battles in the courts.
This question is on gerrymandering. What is your thinking on how to get rid of our gerrymandered election process, including in our own blue state?
Sure. So here's my view on gerrymandering. I have supported for years, and still do, we have a bill, to establish nationwide, nonpartisan drawing of congressional districts, okay? And we should adopt the model. There are a couple models around the country. The models I like best are these quasi-judicial process, like you have in Iowa. There are also other states that have a bipartisan line drawing process, which in my view, California has a bipartisan process, and they have a commission that does this kind of line drawing, which it leads to some less gerrymandering, but it's more about incumbent protection, right? Than it is about just creating, fair districts. And so I do like the quasi-judicial model that Iowa uses, and that is the view. I think we should adopt that model nationally. This is another example where we've been obviously stymied by a lot of folks at the national level who consider it in their interest to maintain the status quo system, because you look at a state like Pennsylvania, which has overwhelming popular vote for the Democratic members of Congress, but the way the lines are drawn in such a way to give a large number of Republican House members from the state of Pennsylvania. And that's true around the country. Now, in Maryland, we have, as you know, we've had a Democratic governor and Democratic state legislatures, and when they drew the lines, we ended up with 7 and 1. We have 7 Democratic congressional districts and 1 Republican congressional district. My view is that it's important for states to do this together. And I will tell you, because if you don't do that, then if Texas doesn't change its approach and Pennsylvania doesn't change its approach, I talked about votes coming down to 1 vote in the United States Senate. Well, this obviously is the House of Representatives, but you could have a very closely divided House of Representatives. Every one of those votes makes a difference. And so we should all be in this together as Americans. And I'm not sure why I would say to Democratic states that, oh, the Democratic states, you've got to do judicial line drawing, but everybody else, you get to do whatever you want. You would have an even more lopsided Congress than you do today. And so, yeah, I'm in favor of nonpartisan line drawing for congressional districts, but I want to do it on a national basis. That's my position. All right?
Thank you. I will say that in India, they have a national election commission that's appointed, and it's pretty much a public service, and they take on not only the drawing of lines, but also to manage and run elections, both the national and state. And of course, in India, Election Day is a national holiday.
Yes, and that's a good idea too. That's a good idea too.
This
I mean, we could talk, there are lots of reforms we should make in terms of elections, and we've put forward model national guidelines for elections, more than model national guidelines. We have a legislation that would essentially establish national requirements for elections in terms of the number of days you can do early voting, essentially a number of ways to allow more people to be able to vote in a convenient manner and make sure that we have access to the ballot box. It's absolutely outrageous that we've got a lot of folks that want to try to win elections by subtraction, right? By denying people access to the ballot box, putting up more obstacles, more barriers, making it more difficult. I mean, that is obviously undermines the whole idea of a democracy. And so this is an area we need to really be pushing on very hard, again, at the national level, in order for us to pass some of this legislation to establish national criteria. We need more votes. I mean, it's as simple as that. But in the meantime, at the state level and other places, we need to keep pushing ahead.
Thank you. This questioner, who thinks you're terrific, wants to know if Congress ever sees those electronic petitions that are so common on Facebook, email, online, etc.
So, first of all, thank you. So I will tell you, when I walk into my office every day in Washington, I say to the two terrific people who are staffing the front desk, what are people calling about today? Just, it's a way to sort of take the temperature of what's going on. And, you know, not surprisingly, you know, people call in when there are major actions pending before the Congress. And so whether it's phone calls or petitions, you know, people do see them. And the issue then is, you know, how effective are they at sort of changing opinion? And I think that, look, I think it's one instrument among many. As I indicated earlier, I think that direct contact and organizing people to turn up at state offices or district offices, and again, I'm talking nationally now, or at town halls, when people have town halls, those are effective ways at actually, you know, getting messages and points across more directly to member of Congress. But I wouldn't want to discourage any form of messaging and communication. I mean, my view is the more the better. I do believe that those, as I said, showing up in person to the extent possible is the most effective way. Letter writing is still an effective way, but like, I think the healthcare battle, as I said earlier, was a real model of citizen engagement. People showing up in huge numbers to town hall meetings, and where there were not town hall meetings, people showing up directly in people's offices and insisting on the opportunity to have their say.
Thank you. This question is on mass incarceration, and especially of people of color. The questioner asks, why are the voices of incarcerated folks of color silenced? What can be done legislatively to lower down the prison industrial complex? Right.
So this is a national disgrace and a national tragedy, and this requires urgent action at the federal level and at the state level. So at the federal level, you had one of the first actions taken by this administration to reverse the Obama policy of getting the private business out of the prison business, which is just insane to have a system where people are profiting from locking more people up. And it was really sickening to see the stocks of some of these for-profit prisons going up after Trump was elected. So at the federal level, we've got to, again, this comes down to votes. I just can't, and it comes down to the ability, you know, exercising political power is about getting the votes to get things done. And if we don't have the votes, we're not going to be able to succeed in doing a lot of these important things at the federal level. But so it was an Obama-era executive order, right? So the new White House comes in and they overturned the executive order. The Obama administration also had both attorney generals establish much smarter sentencing guidelines so that federal prosecutors were essentially told to focus on violent crime and stop locking up and incarcerating people for substance abuse. And we need to put that into law. I will say that I've worked with Senator Cory Booker on a number of these issues during my time in the United States Senate. And we're working on additional legislation. We're working on legislation on the bail bonds issue, the bail bonds scandal. Now, Brian Frosch in our state of Maryland has done a great job on that and many other issues. And so I do want to say, when it comes to criminal justice, a lot more people are locked up in the United States under state laws than under federal laws. And we need to reform federal law, and we need to get away from the legislation that led to incarceration and for all these nonviolent substance abuse issues and other issues. But we do have it within our immediate power through the state legislature and through, if we have a governor who is really committed to criminal justice reform, to really take on that issue in the state of Maryland. Now, they've begun to make progress, but there's a whole lot more in the state of Maryland that we could do, just as we could do it in other states. Because again, the primary sort of law enforcement authority is with the state. Obviously, the Justice Department and the FBI, has its own set of prisons, and we need to make sure that we address these scandals at the federal level. But it's also a scandal at the state level, and it deserves and requires urgent attention.
I just have to correct you as a Native American. Native Americans actually face the most, they get incarcerated the most, the population that gets incarcerated the most at the federal level, and they have the harshest punishments because we're at the federal level. So just keep that in mind, that's important to also ensure that the smallest minority in the United States that faces the most violence by non-Canadians, Native Americans, we're also getting incarcerated, facing the most violence, and having the longest punishment. So it's important for you as a senator,
Right.
U.S. senator, to ensure that. I know you're saying that a lot of this happens at the state level, but at the federal level, you need more.
Right, but you're absolutely right. But and we've had some scandalous situations in Indian country. But a lot of, as you know, a lot of that relates to the federal jurisdictions versus in Indian country. So I understand. You're right, but I agree. Granted, we'll talk.
The next question is about LGBTQ youth. The questioner wonders how you are going to amplify the voices of LGBTQ youth.
Well, we've been working very closely with students throughout the state of Maryland on these issues of LGBT protection, making sure people have their rights protected. And it's one of those really important examples of where the community speaking out is so important. And again, this is an issue where you've got important action needing to be taken at the federal level as well as at the state level. At the federal level, we need to pass legislation that would essentially make sure that people can't be discriminated against in employment and other areas because of their sexual orientation. There's legislation that I co-sponsor that we would like to get passed. In Maryland, at the state level, many years ago, I helped push through a number of these measures to, protect people so they weren't discriminated against based on who they love or sexual orientation. This is another ongoing civil rights battle that we have in our country. We obviously have this really important fight going on right now as well in the U.S. military with respect to transgender individuals, where the president has again made sort of ugly, divisive comments, and the folks in the military who are really focused on our national security in our country want to make sure that every individual who wants to help their country and has the capability of joining the armed forces has the opportunity to do that. We're a stronger country when everybody has that chance. So this is an ongoing battle for all of us around the country. And we have an administration that, unfortunately, in this area and many others, wants to drag us backwards. The Obama administration had made some important progress when it came to the issue of transgender individuals, and this administration seems intent on pulling us backwards. So we'll continue to fight. There's, again, legislation on this issue. Legislation is only as good as your ability to muster a majority, get it passed.
Indeed. Would you like a moment to...
Sure.
You've been at it for a while now.
I'm happy to. All right.
This next question is on gun control. As recent statistics for 2017 show, gun control laws have done nothing to stem the homicide rate in Baltimore. This is more specific to Baltimore. Would you consider repealing the magazine size limit for law-abiding citizens?
So let me say something about the situation in Baltimore and Maryland. And one thing that's important to know is a lot of the guns used in violent crime in Baltimore City come from other states and other parts of the country. Maryland has some good common sense gun safety laws in place. And actually, as people may know, those were challenged. Some of those laws were challenged recently in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the Maryland laws as reasonable regulations in this area. And, this issue has been one where Congress has been grossly negligent in its inability to do more to protect citizens and others in this country from gun violence. I think all of us recognize that there's no one answer here, right? I mean, a gun control law is not going to prevent all gun violence, but common sense gun safety measures can definitely save lives. And there have been a number of important studies, including one out of Johns Hopkins University, that showed in the state of Connecticut, which has had a law on the books similar to the one Maryland recently enacted, but for much longer, actually saw a significant drop in the number of people killed by guns. Now, that obviously did not stop the awful tragedy in Connecticut at Newtown. And so that is why we should also adopt other common sense measures, like limiting bump stocks, like making sure that we can limit the size of magazines nationally, because the reality is that if you have a magazine that can obviously have a lot more ammunition, you can kill a lot more people a lot more quickly. And so by putting on common sense limitations, you can save lives. And I will tell you that when you survey even members of the National Rifle Association, ask them questions about some of these common sense measures, like, do you support a universal criminal background check? The answer comes back yes, in significant majorities, even among NRA members. And so, in my view, you've got an NRA headquarters in Washington that constantly, just constantly is exploiting people's fears, legitimate gun owners, people who are hunting rifles. They are led to believe that the federal government is on its way to taking away their hunting rifles. That is just total nonsense, but it is a scare tactic that is used to stop common sense gun safety measures that can save lives. And so this is a battle that's going to keep going on, and we need to make sure that we address it at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. And again, it's not just one thing. There are obviously lots of other elements that we have to address when it comes to gun violence. Mental health issues, making sure that we address and provide opportunities for people to get help when they need it. But certainly common sense gun safety measures is one thing we can do that will and has been proven to save lives.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, and then I think we'll draw this to a close. This questioner, who is an Army veteran, is asking what is being done for homeless veterans in Maryland.
Well, first of all, to the Army veterans and all the veterans, thank you for your service to our country. And I can tell you that, so here in Montgomery County, under the leadership of County Executive Ike Leggett and the County Council, we've made some important strides in George 11, and the County Council, yeah. We've made some important strides, and I was able to work with them to get these federal VASH vouchers. These are vouchers from the federal level that help provide immediate housing to homeless veterans. And so a year ago, at least in Montgomery County, this county was declared a veterans homeless-free zone. Now, that was good news in Montgomery County. We're working hard to try to expand that to the rest of the state, and of course around the country. We've got to address that as well. And then there are, as you know, in addition to homelessness, there are all sorts of other really important issues we've got to grapple with. The Veterans Administration system, we need to make sure we address the backlog. Also, we have a big backlog in disabilities claims for veterans, and there's been some progress made on those fronts, but we need to make more. I am pleased that the Congress many years ago passed the modernized version of the GI Bill of Rights for those who have served our country overseas more recently, and so that has been a success story. But on the issue of homelessness, again, good news in Montgomery County. We've got to expand that model statewide and to the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Question about this administration, at least trying to say that they support small businesses while working to undermine small businesses, especially minority-owned businesses. The efforts to close down the Minority Business Development Agency is a concern, and wondering what your thoughts are on how to not only counter these kinds of counterproductive efforts, but also to strengthen ways in which small businesses are supported.
Right. And look, small businesses are obviously one of the lifeblood of our economy, and being in the small business, for those of you who are, small business owners, hats off to you, because it is, tough every day, which is why we need to create an environment that supports small business. And the Small Business Administration at the federal level is there to provide some of that support, as are a number of other federal programs, including the one you referenced, and some of them out of the Commerce Department. I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and it was pretty shocking. Well, maybe it wasn't so shocking, but in March of last year, I believe it was, we had testimony in our committee, and the Trump budget essentially eliminated funding for many of the small business programs in the Department of Commerce, and including one, I should say, that had been championed about a week before their testimony by Ivanka Trump, who went to a small business enterprise in Baltimore City, one that I'd visited myself, about a year ago. And it turned out that this program, where she went as part of a, public relations discussion to talk about the small business and the success of this program, the Trump administration had proposed zeroing out the money for that program. There are other important, programs for economic development in small businesses, and I think we need to make sure that we fight back on a bipartisan basis. I will say that within the budget process, some of the good news, at least in the Senate, not as much in the House, but the Senate, is there has been fairly bipartisan opposition to many of the proposed cuts that have been made, whether they're in the area of minority-owned small businesses or other small businesses. So that has got to be a priority. I should also say that when we're making major investments, whether at the federal level or state level, it's really important that as part of that public investment where we're using taxpayer dollars, that we also make it clear that the businesses working on those projects have to be inclusive. We have to make sure that minority-owned small businesses can participate in those programs with federal dollars. And so there's a lot of work to do on that front. And again, that's something that we should be focused on at the state level as well as at the federal level.
Well, I was really tempted to ask you a whole bunch of questions around impeachment. I used my ministerial discretion not to go there for
So you didn't ask me that question, is that what you're saying?
But,
so,
but should you feel so moved?
No. Let me say something about this, because I do think it's important, and I've made it very clear. I've said from the beginning that this, Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States, and it's a very, very bad and challenging situation for our country. This is a great country, and we now have a president who, both in terms of his conduct and his policies, is undermining a lot of the values we all hold dear. My view is that the best way to fight back is the way they did in Virginia. And the best way to fight back is the way they did in Alabama. And when I tell you, it all comes down to votes. It all comes down to votes. You want to get anything done in the United States Congress? You got to have the votes to do it. So at the end of the day, this is about mobilizing everybody who turned out to the marches to fight back against efforts to blow up the Affordable Care Act. And that was a successful effort. And it means mobilizing to do everything we can to stop other bad things happening in Congress, and then working every day to try to get to the point where I have a majority in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. And that's what 2018 is all about. We're in 2018 now. And to do that, we've got to do a couple things. Look, I chair the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. I haven't talked a lot about that tonight, but I'm chairing the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. And our challenge is to try and win seats. Now, you win seats two ways. One, you need a big turnout, right, of people who care passionately about issues that all of us in this room care about and values we share. You also need, in many of the states that we have Senate races in, you're going to have to win independent voters too. You're going to need to get out every Democratic vote and expand the Democratic electorate, but you're also going to have to win independent voters. In places like, you're going to have a lot of states around this country where you're going to have to win, our Senate Democrats are going to have to win back some of the voters who voted for Donald Trump, people who believed that Donald Trump was going to be there for them when it came to pocketbook issues and economic issues. And that's why this tax bill is such a betrayal of what Donald Trump told a lot of those voters on the campaign trail, because it is a huge tax break for corporations, while many other people are either going to see their taxes go up or they're going to get a little temporary tax cut that's going to go away in a couple years. So we've got a lot of work to do. I can tell you on the Senate side, look, in the House side, as you know, everybody's up every 2 years. Everybody in the House, that's 435 members are up. In the Senate, only a third are up, right? And actually now we also have a special election in the state of Minnesota. So we have 26 Democratic senators who are up for election in 2018. There are only 8 Republican senators who are up in 2018. Of the 26 Democratic senators that are up, 10 of them are from states that Donald Trump won in the last election. Okay? On the Republican side, there's only one Republican senator, incumbent senator from a state that Hillary Clinton won. That's Nevada. That's Dean Heller. So we've got a heck of a fight on our hands in the United States Senate. Now the good news is when you look at what happened in Virginia, when you look at what's happening in a lot of these states, people do want senators who are going to hold the Trump administration accountable. Now, I will tell you, in many of these states, there's a big difference between holding the Trump administration accountable and fighting them on issues that are harmful to people in those states, and some of the other sort of responses that we could have to this White House. So it's going to be really important as we go into the 2018 elections that we are very focused on the objective, and that has to be getting out a huge voter turnout and winning over, as they did in Virginia, a lot of the independent voters. And in Texas, vote Ted Cruz out, right? So we have a lot of very good candidates in these states. In fact, as of today, in the 8 states where you have Republican incumbents who are up for election, we have good candidates in 7 of them. We're still working on Mississippi, and you know, after Alabama, you never know what can happen in a state like Mississippi. But I really urge everybody to think about our senators who are running in states, you know, like Missouri and Indiana and other places, and think to yourself, what's the best strategy for them to be successful? And for them to be successful, they need a big turnout, and they need to focus on issues that are important to people in their states and fight on those issues. And that's what they've been doing. And I think that, you know, if they can make sure they go to the voters in their states and say, I've been standing up and fighting for you, that will be something that will serve them well in these elections. So anyway, that is sort of where we are on the 2018 Senate elections. Obviously, the House is at races. As I said, everybody's up everywhere in the country. But given where we were at the beginning of the year, the fact that we have a difficult political playing field that I just outlined, and are still, right as of today, very confident in the position of so many of our senators, and also have opportunities to pick up seats in other Republican-held states, even though there are not that many of them, is a good sign. And I will just close again by saying that what happened in Alabama was a really, really important moment for the country. Obviously, there was a lot going on in that campaign. But at the end of the day, in a state that most people have ranked as the most Republican state in the nation, you had a Democrat who focused on kitchen table issues, a Democrat who had fought for civil rights, a Democrat who prosecuted the KKK for the fire and bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. You had that person win in a state that had previously been represented by Jeff Sessions. So change is in the air, and we need to make sure we get out there and get to the polls in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for being such a wonderful, welcoming, loving community. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and providing these wonderful insights and inspiration and challenge to us as we go through this. Friends, if you would just take just a moment, as I would like to acknowledge folks who really helped make this forum happen today. I particularly would like to thank all the volunteers from Cedar Lane who who helped with being wonderful hospitality ushers when people arrived, to helping with parking, with the sound, with our ASL interpretation. Thank you, Emily. And security, and really making this such a wonderful evening. I would like to close with some words of hope and inspiration that come to us from Judy Chicago. These are familiar words, so if you would just bear with me for just a couple more minutes. And then all that has been divided will merge, and then compassion will be wedded to power. And then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then people will be gentle. And then people will be strong, and then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. All will cherish life's creatures. All will live in harmony with each other and the earth. And then everywhere will be called Eden once again. May that be our aspiration, that we make and strive to make it a reality in 2018. Go in peace. Thank you so much. Really appreciate